and welcome to Peace with Penny. I'm Penny ST, and I'm your host. Israel signing peace agreements with Bahrain, the UAE, Sudan, and Morocco have been great steps in the right direction. Yet we always hear, what about Israelis and Palestinians? Well, I'm here to tell you lots has happened with incredible peacemakers between the two. They just don't often make the news here. I'm hoping my video podcast will change that. We'll be speaking with grassroots Israelis and Palestinians, truly making a difference, who realize that they love the same land but have very different narratives. So why did I get involved? It was the summer of 2014, and for my son's bar mitzvah present, we took him to Israel. Just like many Jewish parents, we wanted him to bond with the Holy Land. It worked perhaps too well. My husband had stayed back at the hotel, and our friends, my son and I, had just stopped in a pharmacy.
Run to the bomb shelter, sweetie, please hurry. I didn't hear the sirens at first, but the Israelis did. They're used to hearing these things. We ran to the back of the storeroom. It was a 12-foot by 24-foot windowless bomb shelter. My heart's pounding. Boom, boom. I hear it and feel the percussion of the exploding bombs. I'm trying not to get sick. I look at my 13-year-old son and I think I'll never forgive myself if something happens to him.
That's an excerpt from a speech I gave to the Orange County Jewish Bar Association. It was the first, but not the last time we had to run to a bomb shelter. Our adventure and my transformation is also the subject of my book, Blasted from Complacency, A Journey from Terror to Transformation in Israel. There is no chapter in a parenting book on what to do when a war starts and you're on a family vacation. Think touring extraordinary and sacred sites mixed with cowering in bomb shelters. I'm still trying to get over the Jewish guilt of taking my son to war for his bar mitzvah present. The impact of being human targets helped me understand the plight of Israelis living like this, and it also made me want to work on peace. How Israel is often described on the news is not what I'd seen with my own eyes. And I felt Palestinian parents also preferred their children playing safely in their backyards. The missiles exploded just near enough to blow apart my world as I knew it, forever changing me. And you'd never recognize my life today with what it was like then. I believe I found my life's purpose. So I'm very excited to have our first video podcast interview with Shaul Judelman. He's a co-founder of Roots-Shorashim-Judur with Ali Abu Awad and Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger, an incredible organization that I've grown to love over the years. Roots is located in the West Bank, what many people call occupied territory. Roots' members are made up of Israeli settlers who meet with Palestinians to forge a better, more cooperative life with their neighbors. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is part of their day-to-day life. The rest of the world thinks Israelis and Palestinians are enemies, and yet these peacemakers foster a grassroots movement of understanding, nonviolence, and transformation among Israelis and Palestinians. Hello, and welcome everyone and Shaul to our first broadcast of Peace with Penny. I'm talking today with Shaul Judelman, and I have to say, after knowing members of the organization since shortly after our trip in 2014, there is an example of doing God's work on earth and its roots. But before we go on, let me say if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box, and we'll be answering them at the end. To give you a bit of background on Shaul Judelman is the co-director of Roots, a local Israeli-Palestinian initiative active within the communities at the front lines of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict between Hebron and Jerusalem. Roots is an on-the-ground practice of ideas developed by the late Rabbi Menachem Froman, who provided an example of how to pursue the Jewish future in the land with humility, while not being blinded by ideology, fear, or hate. Raised in the United States, Shaul immigrated to Israel in 2000, seeking his people, land, and place. He received rabbinic ordination from the Bat Ayin Yeshiva in 2006 and taught in Yeshiva Simchat Shlomo in Jerusalem. Despite coming of age in the hopeful era of Oslo, the bus bombs of the 90s, the violence of the Second Intifada, and particularly the murder of innocents around him, made clear to him at the time that there was no partner and hence no peace process. But meetings with local Palestinian leaders led him to see new responsibilities and the option of working for change through Israeli-Palestinian partnerships. These meetings evolved into the founding of Roots, whose people-to-people work aims to build understanding, whose activism addresses the suffering and injustice faced by each community, and which is creating a new discourse about Israeli and Palestinian identities and futures. Shaul balances work at Roots with life as a husband and father of 4 in the town of Tekoa. Thanks for joining us, Shaul. It's always great to speak to you. Out of curiosity,
we have now 3 rabbits too, so it's a lot more work.
Yeah, I had 1 and I thought that was a lot. Out of curiosity, I'd like to ask you a personal question first as to why did you make Aliyah, which is the term used for Jews who moved to Israel?
That's a lot. There's a lot of long answers to that question. The simple short of it is, I think, just a sense of home and purpose that I felt in Israel were just too powerful to think about stepping away from. My family immigrated to the U.S. when I was little. I grew up in Seattle, Washington. I grew up going to a conservative synagogue. We weren't an Orthodox family, a religious family, but I think I always had an interesting relationship to America as an immigrant. And I think something opened up in Israel with a sense of being home in such an ultimate way. It was something I was looking for. So it was good timing for me. I was 21. I just finished university. The project of Israel, the project of the Jewish people was just kind of gave a framing for meaning in life in so many ways. And so I didn't use my return ticket.
Can you please explain what your organization, Roots-Shorashim-Judur, does to work on peace in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Sure. So everybody, I assume out there knows, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a large, painful, long-lasting, some people like the adjective intractable conflict. And it goes through its silences of violence, but definitely the pain is felt in some places more than others, and by some communities more than others. Talk about there's asymmetries in the conflict. Israelis and Palestinians definitely experience it differently. Even the words we'd use to describe it might be very different. But what Roots first and foremost does is it asks people to take responsibility where they live. That's our call, meaning we live here as Israelis or Palestinians. At some point you recognize or you give up the fantasy that the other side will somehow disappear. And then you do that and you recognize, well, where is this going? And on most accounts, it's not going anywhere good right now. It hasn't been processed in the peace process. It hasn't been processed in the way our societies think about each other either. So Roots tries to be kind of a catalyst for making that call within these societies. And specifically, I'll focus down, because it's such a big conflict. So you can work on the political level and advocate for this solution or that solution. There's so many ways to go about it. There are so many different channels of work needed. But what we find is when you face up to what the conflict is, it's too big. It's very disempowering. It's very despairing. But when you face up to your own life and your family's life, your community's life, and what's going on in your location, all of a sudden, I think we find we're capable of some kinds of change. So that local kind of theory of change, of working locally, I guess think globally, act locally, is very a part of us. And as of now, we have 3 active chapters of Roots in different parts in what people call the West Bank or Judea-Samaria. Each one of those chapters in different stages of development. But I kind of catalog into our work into 3 different foci. One is in people-to-people work and just making meetings and encounters on a personal level. And believe it or not, that people who don't know where we are or what the reality is here, it's obviously hard to imagine that is, but there's no here, there's no intramural soccer leagues where our kids, you know, meet and play sports together. The schools and life are incredibly separate. The media is separate. The language is separate. The story of what's going on, the story of what happened on the news yesterday is separate. And the encounters that do happen, which there, you know, there are encounters. There's definitely we drive on the same roads mostly. We shop. Sometimes we shop in the same places, even work. But to create a people-to-people work where identity and story and even your pain is welcome is something that we don't find other than that kind of roots program, let's say. So people-to-people work is one thing we do. But I always add a but there. People-to-people work is powerful on a personal level, but it's not going to start making the larger changes. And I think it's a luxury to think that we can just do people. It's a privilege or a luxury to think we can just do people-to-people work and think that's enough. From our analysis of where the conflict is, one of the prime problems is that both sides feel very convinced in very visceral levels that there's no partner for peace. Now, if you're on the Israeli side of the spectrum, you think, of course we want peace. It's them that is. If you're on the Palestinian side, imagine you think exactly vice versa. We were sacrificing for peace and look what they did. So we can judge about whether that's true or not. I don't really care. I think that's the reality. So I understand from that then if the Palestinians don't believe Israelis are partners for peace, then it's our job as Israelis to show we are. And there's actually a myriad of ways which Roots takes on trying to do that, and vice versa. The Palestinian leadership finds a way to. So I call that activism, meaning it's good to talk, good to understand things, but it's a lot more powerful when you get out and sweat together, or when you go out and take a risk together, or when you stand up for each other. So organizing kind of visits to victims of violence. On the Israeli side, as you know, as an army, I was on the phone a lot today with the army. Talking about some policies that are going on, trying to change some policies, trying to get them to look closer at issues here. And again, starting on the local and then from there moving up. And the last thing I'll say, so I always give long answers to good questions, so it's a sign it's a good question. What else Roots does to help bring peace is a little bit of trying to reframe the conversation. And it's try to bring up a new way of speaking about the conflict, a new discourse around how we speak about these things. And when I say speak about these things, I mean a couple of things. I mean our identity. What it means for Jewish Israelis, for that, what does that mean for Israeli Zionism? What does that mean for you? Palestinianism and Islam and these other factors in Palestinianity, to bring those to the table. And I think after 27 years, the paradigm that peace, if you said you were for peace until now, the last 30 years, that means you supported the Oslo peace process. Believe it or not, there's maybe 27 other suggested models of finding a political peace. So I think trying a new discourse that learns from some of the mistakes that perhaps we made in the Oslo peace process and tries to apply them in a new way. And I think that takes some reframing of what we're doing here in many ways. And that's an internal challenge to both myself as an Israeli Jewish Zionist. That means reframing some things there for myself. And on the Palestinian side as well, I think, you know, can this Zionist and Palestinian story find a way to where they fit together, where they acknowledge each other, recognize each other, and can, you know, someday come to see each other as really partners in this land.
Great answer. And I actually wanted to dig a little deeper because I know you have some programs that are incredible. You mentioned the Army. Why don't you talk about what you do with the military in their pre-Army academies?
Sure. So there's two levels here. I think one is as Roots, as an Israeli Roots activist, part of my mandate is to take responsibility on my side, and there's a lot of the Israelis in Roots. That means we talk to the army and try to affect things. But in Israel, there's another program. It's not part of the army. It's called it's these pre-military academies. You know, in Israel, there's a mandatory draft. So at 18, everybody is enlisted either in you know, combat service in the military or in kind of a national service here, which could be acting as a clown in a hospital for sick kids. It could be all kinds of things. But about 20 years ago, they started running a program for kids that they thought had leadership potential to kind of give them another year of preparation before they go into the army. And they called it a mechina, a preparatory academy. And that was 20 years ago. Nowadays, they've become an incredibly rich part of Israeli kind of society. It's after high school. It's now they're not just for elite kids, they're for really all kinds of kids and from all backgrounds. And a lot of them have as an agenda of fixing some of the dissonance and discord within Israeli society. So bringing religious and secular kids together for a year, kids from different parts of the country, different socioeconomic statuses or places. But anyhow, these kids spend a half a year to a year preparing before they go in the army, doing a lot of volunteering, a lot of traveling, trying to understand. And almost all of them do a week studying Judea-Samaria. They spend maybe 3 days to 5 days and hearing what the conflict's about from this part of the land, meeting. So we do a lot of sorry,
may I interrupt?
Yeah.
Just could you explain for the audience why you call the West Bank Judea-Samaria?
Sure. Yeah. So there's many names for this land, and you can get in trouble with every single one of them. We can call it Palestine, Israel, and they're talking about the exact same piece of land. As a Jew, from the Jewish tradition, the area that is the West Bank in maybe international political terms, for the Jewish people, is always called Yehuda, which is where Judah is Yehuda. So that's from Jerusalem south, which is where the tribe of Judah lived. And then we have, on the north, we have Sumeria. So these are kind of just traditional Jewish names for the same area. And here we are. I'm kind of trying to share my screen here. So here is an outline of what people call the West Bank. So here's the Jordan River, if you can see my cursor, which is the border between Israel and Jordan. So this is the West Bank of the Jordan. If you go back in the history of the conflict in the original partition plan, Jordan was created on the east side of the river, and this is the West Bank, which Jordan occupied from the 48 war until 1967. So this was the West Bank. Okay, and here is Gaza. But in Jewish history, if I was to be very slick, I would pull up a map of the breakdown of the tribes of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel. So from Jerusalem here south through Hebron was kind of the area where the tribe of Judah lived. And the area to the north called the Shomron, which we call today the Shomron, was a mixture of some of the tribes that lived from the Benjamin tribe lived around here, around Jerusalem, then to Ephraim and Asher and up to the north. And so that's that kind of traditional Jewish term. And because the conflict is such a battle and it fits into everything, you could say by calling it Judea-Samaria, I'm denying, so Oslo accorded this territory to be the Palestinian. This is supposed to be Palestine. This is Palestine. These are the Palestinian territories, or the occupied territories, or the disputed territories. So I kind of use West Bank and Judea-Samaria to try to bring both sides. So that was just an aside. Going back to the pre-military academy. So they do this half year or a year of preparing for the army. And like I said, these are 18-year-old Israelis who were born then in 2002, 2003. They're born into the reality of post-Oslo. And most of them have really a lot of them have never heard the Palestinian story. We don't, reality has changed a lot in this conflict over the last 30 years. And so for many of them trying to understand, I think Roots is one of the few places where they hear a Palestinian telling their life story, their national story, the struggles they face. And you think about these kids in 6 months or a year, many of them will be out there on a checkpoint in the army. And this may be the first time they meet a Palestinian as a person, which is, as much as what makes the headlines, of course, is the violence and the terror groups and the extremist groups and the militant groups. But 99% of these people's daily interaction with Palestinians are going to be simply civilians going to work, going back, people on their way here and there. So trying to give them a sense of what that responsibility is like. And it's one thing for me to tell them, but for them to hear from a Palestinian is a very powerful thing that, know on that checkpoint, you're going to be representing the Jewish people to all of us, and how you're going to act there and how you're going to treat us when you're going about your search and you're about your duty, can make a lot of difference in where this and what people feel, what comes up afterwards. So I think that's a tremendous responsibility. And I think that bringing that charge or that framing it is really important. And sometimes we do longer programs for those programs too, kind of extended meetings with, we also have a young adult program with 16 to 18-year-olds, local Israeli-Palestinians. And oftentimes they'll also meet those kids and give them a sense of what life's like out here.
Would you mind describing, because I don't think everybody really knows what a checkpoint is like, what its purpose is?
Sure. There are, okay, if I go back, I guess I can go back to this map. I'll take it back. Here in this, so like I said, here's the West Bank, Judea-Samaria territories. And here there's a line, it's called the Green Line. And what the Oslo Accords proposed was to make a two-state solution where basically roughly this border would become Palestine, and over here would remain the state of Israel. So when Palestinians who live in the West Bank today, pre-Oslo, before Oslo Accords, they were allowed, there was no, you could travel anywhere. Israelis and Palestinians could travel across this entire land. There was no limitations on that. But since Oslo, and then what happened was the resistance to Oslo on the Palestinian side, for instance, the suicide bombings. And all of a sudden there started, being bus bombs in Tel Aviv, and the demand for security created what they call kind of part of the security apparatus. Well, the first step they did was to say, okay, now as we're moving towards two separate states, Palestinians who want to leave the West Bank and enter Israel, not everybody can come. You have to have a security clearance. And that means that if you have something in your background, you were arrested for throwing rocks and you're 15, that means if you want to get a job working in a restaurant or whatever you're going to be doing, you might have a harder time getting that security clearance. So around the West Bank, there's, I don't know, about 12 checkpoints, which are more like a passage, like a border control, almost like if there was a border there, then that's the border. And for Palestinians, it is a border. It's a hard border. There's now, after the second Intifada was built, a wall, a security barrier, a wall that goes around a lot of the West Bank. So the only place for Palestinians to pass through there to get to work is to have a permit, which they get from the Israeli army. There's about 120,000 Palestinians who enter every single day to go work in Israel. But other than those 220,000 permits, Palestinians in the West Bank aren't allowed into Israel. And that's part of the security and the Oslo process. But then there's also checkpoints within. So within the West Bank, the checkpoints come and go in terms, kind of in relationship to the security situation. Like in the second Intifada, there were many checkpoints all over. And slowly as things quieted down, a lot of those checkpoints have been taken down, but the army will put them up. They can make a flying checkpoint. There's a few that stay in place. For instance, there's one where the road comes towards Jericho, which for Palestinians is a connection between the southern West Bank and the northern West Bank. There's a checkpoint, the container checkpoint. And sometimes it might be just going through with no problem, but if there's a security alert, they could be checking every single car, and you could be waiting in traffic for an hour or longer. In Ari or in Gush Etzion, like I said, when there's some kind of security alert, the army will put up checkpoints. If there's some other kind of reason that they have, people don't know what's going on, but they could start checking cars or letting them go.
Well, there are obviously valid reasons for the checkpoints in that, when the violence happens, whether it's, terrorist bombings or, unfortunately, there's so many different varieties. I would understand if I would want the security checkpoints personally, but I also understand the difficulty as a Palestinian that they can't travel freely, and they have to wait very long times, right, to get into Israel.
I'd say up until about a year and a half ago, Israel started revamping the entrance points into Israel, and I can't say they made tremendous improvements, but until then the pictures are horrible. It's people, it's tens of thousands of people trying to get through a checkpoint. And now they've kind of introduced with the biometric passes, and it's very and the ones, and they're slowly refurbishing turning them all into that. And what I've heard people say it's a night and day. I mean, it's what was a really humiliating experience of being crowded through channels, and there were times when people were pushed and suffocated even, and just people pushing in to get through to work. And it's definitely actually there was a very right-wing Israeli politician who came to visit one about 3 years ago. Very right-wing politician. And when he got there and he saw what the Palestinian workers were going through to get to work every day, he said, this is a blight on the name of Israel. And he accorded the budgets to kind of make the changes. But yeah, no, it's a friend of mine says we're living on the ruins. We're living in the ruins of Oslo, of the Intifada, and a 15-year-old Palestinian kid today who was born after that second Intifada is born into this reality. He doesn't even, he doesn't remember what things were like. And that's definitely one of the real challenges in this conflict. I'm speaking from an Israeli perspective, is you have these militant groups that are radical militant groups, but they're within a civilian population. And like I said, 99% of people are just going about their business on their way to work. But the fear is very real. And that for me is one of the things to realize where the roots of the conflict lie. We get caught up in the conversation about politics and solutions and identities and religious motivations, but so much of this conflict is really driven by just very human realities of fear, what it means to go run to a bomb shelter, what it means to know that a person was stabbed, that there's an attempted stabbing of just a person who looked like a person on the side of the road, but pulled out a knife and stabbed somebody. So if we go back to the goal of what we call the terrorists, of Hamas terrorism in the 1990s, their goal was to stop the peace process. How do you stop the peace process? So using violence as a means at civilians is to show civilians that to scare them, that peace will mean death. And that message, unfortunately, really worked. And here we are, here we are now. If we want to talk about peace, we have to undo that damage, that fear, that trauma. We have to find a trust again, which is a very uphill battle.
One of the ways I know that you do work on trying to take down some of that fear and that hate that is so pervasive on both sides is when something does happen, you do try to help out. Can you give some examples of that?
Yeah, in a sense, I was trying to find solidarity, acts of solidarity, advocacy. Sure, I think that's kind of the, I'll bring up a picture here. About a few months ago, we got a report from some of our partners that that their olive trees were hacked down. This is something that happens here. People are looking for a way to go lash out, and here's a picture from so in the middle of the night, some Jewish vigilantes, probably teenagers. I'd wager that 90% of the daily violence we find in the news here is really done by what we call youth at risk. But they headed out and they took their saws and they went and chopped down about 300 olive trees of a Palestinian family. So when we found this out, 2 days later, one of our Palestinian activists told us what had happened. So we made contact with the family and we arranged to go out there with our youth group and Israeli and Palestinian youth, all Israeli Palestinian kids from the neighboring villages. We went out there and here we are picking olives together, helping them out, supporting. Afterwards, we went to go visit the farmer whose land was damaged and visited him.
Could you bring up the photo? Sorry.
Bring up the photo?
Yeah, we could see him, but not really. Yeah.
So yeah. So that's a picture of Rav Hanan Schlesinger, who's one of the other co-founders and major people involved in Roots, with a Palestinian farmer, just doing the olive harvest, getting our hands dirty together, being there. That kind of work's very important. On the other side, I can tell a story about a few years ago, there's a group of Jewish kids had a kind of a prayer space on a hill. And it was a tense time, and some Palestinians came in and set the place on fire. Right. So when some of our Palestinian activists, it was not a it was like a hill, it was like a hilltop, and they were praying. They had a little prayer space there. And when Palestinians found out that they had burned holy books there, they came and visited the rabbi, and we made a meeting for them with the rabbi and another kind of leader of the town, kind of the mayor, and they presented them with Jewish prayer books to replace those that were damaged. Those are kind of small little stories, but that kind of work on the micro level. Today we found out a case of some Palestinians who have land next to a Jewish settlement, and when they came to work their land this last week, some of the residents, the Jews in the town, called the police, called the army, says we don't feel comfortable coming so close to the houses to work the land. So right now we've been intervening there, trying to make sure they have access to their land, trying to get working there. On the Israeli side, we're working with the army to make sure they said, what about coming up? When's the good days to come? How, it's their land, it's their right to work their land. It's not fair that they don't, so intervening in these kinds of places and trying to bring back that value. And also I think within that, it's also about advocating, I was on the phone today with several Jewish leaders who's speaking right. There's been a rash of kind of vigilante violence. To go really zoom in the last month, has seen a tremendous rise in kind of Jewish settler attacks on Palestinians. And it's come out of a long story of frustration and anger, and there's a lot of the young people are furious. Just events of the last month, but trying to find where's the leadership who's gonna set down the lines of what's okay and what's not okay in this struggle. And throwing rocks at passing Palestinian cars is a crime. It's the same crime we charge Palestinians with. But who's the leadership who's brave enough to stand up and say that? And on a deeper level, instead of not, I'm not a big fan of condemnations. Mm-hmm. Who's going to work on this with our youth? Who's running the programs to engage? Who's bringing up the conversation with parents? And that's some of the kind of work we do very much on like the inside of our communities, which I think is also that advocacy or solidarity work. Sometimes it's across, sometimes it's internal. I know a Palestinian town where there used to be a lot of rock throwing, and I remember I used to get almost daily reports on my WhatsApp about the rock throwing by the town, and Palestinian leadership in the town, some of them involved with Roots, got together. They said, what happens? These kids go out, throw rocks. The army comes in looking for them. They shut the whole place down. The kids flee. It's not good. People are scared to come to our village, and really a combination of the business owners, our activists, and the religious leaders in the mosque. They started speaking against this. We can't let our youth, they're just getting themselves in trouble. And it's, in America, I don't know what kids do today. When you're 17 years old and you're angry at society, you go out and I don't know what you do. People do things.
My son always just grunted a lot.
Okay.
I was wondering if he could speak words anymore. Besides, whatever. What do we have to eat?
Right. Kids will be kids, but here, you get that same, angsty teenage energy, but you can plug it into your national cause and do some and potentially do some damage. But it's playing, and it's on the one hand, you can call it Jewish terrorism or Palestinian terrorism. But if you go a little bit deeper, it's got to do a lot with youth at risk, with everything from peer pressure to testosterone to also challenges of hate and racism, all kind of like all the other kinds of things. These are also of course, these are all kids growing up in a conflict zone. And I think part of the issue is, I think part of these kids just want to say, there's something very simple here. That's the enemy. They're attacking us. What are you blabbering on about this ending? Let's be real. And that's Palestinian or Israeli youth. What are you telling us politicians it's going to change or there's going to ever be peace? They hate us. And I think for a lot of them, as a young person in this community, growing up here in this conflict, you're witness to a lot of pain. If you're a Palestinian, you have the pain you see. If you're an Israeli, you have the pain you see. You see people in your community being killed. You see the violence. You see the army. You see house militias. You see all this injustice. And I think the youth here grow up with a deep sense of, youth need to feel that their systems, their authorities are actually taking care of them. When they feel that their parents or their government can't take care of them, when you get to be 18 years old, you decide, I'm going to take care of myself. And I think that kind of the psychological reading or sociological parts of what's going on there are important if we want to do more than just condemning and say, how do we move forward in these things? So trying to bring up that conversation within our communities here is something that we've been especially the last month, kind of very, very active with. It's kind of why I'm thinking more about it these days.
But isn't the violence encouraged by, for instance, the PA and naming Palestinian schools after terrorists and the salaries paid to the remaining families after perhaps the terrorist blows themselves up, etc.
Yes.
What would you? It seems like they're raised even in their schools to believe in that. So how do you combat that?
So I think, one of the things I remember, there's a famous quote that Ehud Barak once said. He said, if I was a Palestinian, I think in the heat of the late night, the breakdown of the peace process, he says, if I was a Palestinian, I probably would have been a suicide bomber. For us, we Israelis are terrorists. On the Palestinian story, those are their freedom fighters. Those are their fighters going out to fight. And the way a society carries a struggle is by glorifying its fighters, those people who refused to take it sitting down and they went out and did something. I don't want to rationalize it, but I think it's important to understand because it's really it's horrible. You know, it's obviously horrible, and it's not providing the, you know, it's, you know, for some people, I think there are cases where it's that incentive of and I think even the payments are probably just aren't really, that's the external side of it. The internal side of it is that's a space of honor to go down fighting. And there's a, you know, about 4 years ago, there was a big rise in attacks that people call the knife intifada, because the attacks weren't being made by people who were associated with ideological groups like Hamas or Islamic Jihad. They're really 19-year-olds and 20-somethings. And I remember the Israeli Secret Service, the Shabak, internal service, they kind of, as it was dying down, they kind of looking back at what was going on here, they produced a fascinating statistic. They said suicide in Palestinian society in the last year went down by 75%, while violent attacks on soldiers went up, you know, by 200%, 500%. And what their kind of analysis is that, you know, it makes no difference for the soldier facing or the person being stabbed or being attacked. But in terms of the motivations, they realized a lot of these people were at a certain dead end in life, maybe from society, maybe things they had done that got them in trouble, maybe their own despair, and realized if I go out attacking an Israeli, I go out as a hero and I bring honor to my family. So it's true, there's a big problem in the conflict that the people who do that are seen as heroes. And you're right, we can't really find peace when our heroes remain those who inflict pain and violence on the other side. That's true. I think that's, so that has to stop if we want to move forward. But the way to stopping that is a really interesting question. Now, I think, so, you know, the result, I don't remember, how do you say it? Resorting to violence is the way to achieve our goals. So it's always been there in this conflict. Violence has always been an option on the table. But there came this time when there was a peace process, and and you know, and the question of how well side managed to rally in their vigilantes and extremists for the national consensus. Okay, we both failed on both sides. There are incidents on both sides that failed. But I think that question in the Palestinian society about, you know, the failure of the peace process, the one way to undo extremism is to provide progress through the peace process. And I think there'll always be a hardcore that will never accept peace with us, and they'll always be there. And that really the only thing to do against them is security and you know, to meet force with force. But for the bulk of society who might get drawn into that, but could also not be, I think there's more of an onus to keep on providing good progress towards peace. You know, it's true that the Palestinian school system can undo what it talks about as Israelis, but we can also play a role there by showing up as a person who respects them, showing up as a person who sees their struggle. And I don't have to give up my identity or my beliefs or my struggle for that either. But I think that's, you know, we've fallen into this very zero-sum perspective, and that's kind of what led it, you know, it's what they call slay and pay but I think it goes deeper than just the payments. I think on the societal level, it's talking about something about what's seen as honorable here.
What are you, I know that you've got a youth group and after school program and you visit schools. What do you do there?
So our young adults program is a year-long program for 16 to 18-year-olds. Men and women, young men and women who are growing up in the communities around us. They're meeting every other week. And the program's divided into 3 sections, actually. The first is to them to meet each other in their collective identities that we carry. First is religious identities as Jews and Christians and Muslims, and kind of exploring what that religion means to you. How do you practice your religion? And I think that's religion here is sometimes a nice first step into the base of these things. Afterwards, the next third is really about understanding, so what is the Israeli story? What you guys are Zionists? What does that mean? You guys are Palestinian? What does that mean? I thought you're Arabs. What does that mean, Palestinian? What does that mean to you? And what's your collective story? And kind of learning and going back. And then in that, they start doing projects. And the way our youth program works, it's very about empowerment based. The youth design the next meeting. You know, they have to, if we're going to talk about the Holocaust, we're going to the Holocaust. So if we're going to talk about what happened in 1948, so you'll find an Israeli kid who grew up in Gush Etzion giving a presentation about the massacre in Deir Yassin, about what is a famous story in the 48 war. And a Palestinian from a Palestinian town like Hebron, giving a presentation about the massacre in Kfar Etzion, which is, which is phenomenal. And the last third, after we've gone through that, then it goes a little bit more personal, and their personal experiences in the conflict. And by then, the groups understood, and I think there's the ability to hold kind of the pain. And the truth is, we try to hold that part of the pain off to the end of the year. Oftentimes, it doesn't work, because oftentimes the events of life take over. There was a young Palestinian who was killed by the army in an attempted attack about 3 weeks ago, who was a close friend of his and her family. 2 years ago, Israeli Ari Fuld, who was murdered, was the parent of friends of kids in our program. So the violence is always there, and those moments, which are oftentimes the make or break moments, when the kids come with real pain, anger, frustration, needing to hear from the other side what partnership means, and it's, I have to really I take my kippah off to our staff, the staff and the counselors that do an incredible job in working and keeping that going and being there for them. We also do younger. We found that for Israeli and Palestinian kids here don't speak the same language. So in the youth program, everything's in translation, and as part of the program, they're also studying a little Arabic, studying Hebrew. But for younger kids, so we found photography is an amazing way to bridge the gap. And we actually have a few very talented photographers, a woman named Saskia Keeley, who actually sits on our board of Friends of Roots in the United States, and a man named Bruce Schaffer, who lives in Jerusalem. And they both run for us photography workshops. So we might be bringing a group of Israeli and Palestinian kids for a once a week workshop. And they take out the cameras and they have to go photograph each other. They have to learn to tell a story by using the camera. And it's really amazing to see this kind of nonverbal. This is from the very first group about 6.5 years ago. These are my pictures, so this doesn't bear any reflection on what they do. And it's amazing. Here you have, so these kids the kids in this picture are all now 17, 18, 19. And there's Bruce there, showing how to work the camera. That's a great program. We run a summer camp, which brings about 70. I'll say at the end of the photography workshop, we have an exhibition. Bring some watermelon. We print out the pictures and put them on the wall, and the parents come. And what's really amazing is, while the kids might have been together for the last 6 weeks, 7 weeks, every week together and visiting each other, the parents, some of it's their first time sitting in a room with an Israeli or with a Palestinian. And you can feel the tension. You can feel the tension in the beginning. And as we call each kid up, and Bruce hands their certificate and talks about the way he saw what they have in their eye, how they see things, and hear each other clapping and applauding to those kids, it's really something incredibly powerful. By the time we break out the cake and all the kids have their certificates, to see even what happened in that hour-and-a-half meeting between parents of kids. So that's another way we do these programs.
That's very interesting to me, because I've always said, being a older mom at 44, that as he was growing up, when you're going to have a kid, you're so excited at what you're going to teach him this and teach him that. And I've found he's taught me so much more. And that's been the surprise, because there's nobody in the world that I would do so much for and interested in making myself a better person for than my son. And from what you're saying, they're doing the same right there in front of your eyes. Yeah.
It's amazing what happens there. I mean, the kids are definitely our teachers in so many of these places. I didn't do justice to the work they do there. I want to honor Bruce Schaffer, our photographer. This is some of the other right? Let's see if I got that back up again.
Well, Saskia, I've known for years as well, and she's going to be one of the people that I interview. So we'll get into more. I know, as you know, obviously, she does the same type of photos, except with women, because being more Orthodox communities, the men seem to get more involved than the women, but she has women taking photos, Israelis and Palestinians.
These are you seeing these pictures now from her group?
Yes, but please, they're wonderful.
Yeah, so that kind of work here, you know, and the testimonials we get, the feedback we get from these women after the program. Again, these women looking into each other's eyes from 2 feet apart from each other. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen here. And the impact it has, and you know, my friend Ziara, is if you gain a mother, you gain a family. And so that's also, so, you know, for instance, tomorrow night, actually, we have an event. You know, obviously Corona has been a challenge for this kind of work. You can't,
yes.
You're not allowed to be this close, right? That's too close for Corona. So, and we've, you know, Zoom is great, but it has its limitations, especially for kind of emotionally charged kind of meetings. So what we've found to do is do a little more presentations on Zoom and a little less of the meetings that we haven't tried to do. I don't think it's right to try to do these kinds of emotionally charged meetings over the Zoom. But tomorrow night, for instance, we have a Palestinian speaker speaking to a group of Israelis, giving an overview of the Palestinian health system. How does the health system work over there? We don't know. I want to learn, especially with Corona, what's going on. We had an Israeli give a lecture about interfaith work between Israel and the Gulf states. So giving these kinds of insights into the other side of society to, I think so many of it, because of the conflicts, we see each other as such flat people, you know, Israeli occupier, you know, land thief, you know, not welcome, Palestinian terrorist, rock thrower, source of threat, and that's it, you know, and that's it, you know. So much of on the news stream we see in our news, the main way that we present each other is either the injustice or the brutality that each other is inflicting. So adding to that sense, and a lot of people come to Roots and say, oh, I had no idea that this is going on in their society. I had no idea this is part of what that means to you. I had no idea that these are things that are going on in your society. That kind of discussion is happening. So, you know, kind of giving this depth to, you know, if Israelis and Palestinians are going to be partners and sign a peace treaty someday, that means that we trust what's going on. We're aware of what's going on there. We see ourselves reflected in the things going on there. And that takes some work from where we're kind of the base zero, the ground zero that we're all starting at.
Do your participants still get negative feedback from their neighbors for participating?
Yeah, I mean, the pace, I mean, it's one, on both sides, there exists some very, if you look at Hadassah Fruman, one of the Israeli also founders and leaders of the project, you know, posted very clearly on her Facebook page the other day about, you know, what the problem of the violence coming from our youth. And you can see people, you know, why do you empathize with the enemy? Why don't you say the same things when they throw rocks at us? You know, when you start identifying on any level with somebody who for bulk of your community is seen as an enemy and not much more, you've got some explaining to do. Or you got, you know, you're seeing things of, you know, I think the people, both Israelis and Palestinians, that get involved with Roots and get into the work and start developing trust and a sense of this audacious word of let's do this work. Where for many societies, there's no point, you know, it's drops in the bucket. And so how to present it to the outside, to people not in that space, is a very challenging question on both sides. And on the Palestinian side, you know, it takes different forms. You know, the Palestinian side, you know, where we are, we're settlers, you know. In the Palestinian, you know, from a very simple way, you can say, if you want to make peace, you have to leave your homes. That's what the Oslo Accords mandated. And and if Palestinians are seen as justifying that, that's in a sense treason. So Roots isn't saying that the way things are is great and we just need to make a few cosmetic changes. Roots is saying we need to reboot the entire understanding of what a peace process means. And for Jewish rights and Palestinian rights, you know, for the Jewish story and the Palestinian story. The Palestinian refugee story is not a question that's going away. If we want to talk about really ending the conflict, that needs to come back on the table in some way, in a way that's given its respect and dignity in the same way that I want respect and dignity for my people's story. You know, we can sit proudly on, you know, you started the war, you lost, let's move on. But that doesn't really work in marriage. In a certain way, you know, if we're going to be sharing this land, we need to learn to share the house. So Roots is, we're careful. We're cautious of what we put out. We try to do it in a way that's kind of respectful of the pain and hurt and that's out there. And I think it's also been a process for ourselves of learning, what we're doing, and I understand, from a Palestinian perspective, that one of the challenges I think that both sides need such different things. They're in a space where they can hear such different things, and what one side can sometimes hear, something the other side doesn't seem like doing the work for the other side.
Yeah, I've heard you say that peace building in the Israeli community versus peace building in the Palestinian community are different. Could you explain that a little bit deeper?
Sure. One of the classic things, when people write a sentence about the conflict, what we want to see comes, they always say this phrase, security and rights. As an Israeli, I have a lot of my rights. There's a few things that I could get more right. I can get a few more, but I have a lot of rights. I have a state. I have a passport that says Israel on it. I have a sense of the Jewish home. I have a lot of things that I have an army that's mine. If I feel that I didn't do something, I have who to turn to. What I don't have is a sense of security. It's what Israelis need to find for Israelis to sense as a partner. They didn't hear Palestinians who speak against the violence, who show that they're working also, for our security, and that violence is not an option. And that's something that Israelis are looking for in that meetings. And that's the kind of actions that Palestinian society can show that will convince us in some way. For Palestinians, though, the other part of Israeli wants security and Palestinians want rights. Palestinians don't have a state. They can't become Israelis. In many parts, within the West Bank after Oslo, all of Area C is under Israeli control, which means the Israeli army decides who can and cannot build a house on their own land. And Palestinians have no representation in that process. So Oslo was supposed to set up something else, but it didn't. So Palestinians want to be able to go to the sea. Palestinian kids growing up in Hebron can't go to the beach. There's no beach for them to go to. If they have no port of exit, there's no airport to fly out of. So Palestinians are looking for rights. So the conversation that Palestinians need to hear from Israelis is that we see the lack, we can get into why, and the question of how we got here is important in the context, and it's, what I think it's a lot of it's, but a lot of what Palestinians are suffering for is done in the names of Israeli security. What a lot of Israeli security, what a lot of Israelis are feeling a lack of security from is Palestinians finding ways to call for their rights, if it's violent or non-violent. So that's this kind of, we're speaking on two different planes when we talk about peacemaking in some ways. I think Roots does point to a place where there's a space, another space where we're both in a sense denying each other's identity. And that's a space where maybe there's some equality. We're both equally denying each other's claim that this is really their land, because we're in this zero-sum game about that. So that's where Roots is trying to change the discourse, that saying this land is Israel doesn't mean it's not Palestine, and vice versa. But that's why I feel like the peacemaking, what you need to do for each side to feel peace, is very different.
Has the Abraham Accords with UAE and Morocco and Bahrain and Sudan, any of that impacted you folks? It impacted some parts. It's had some negative impact, but I think in the long term, there's hopefully some serious positive impact to come out of these things. Negative impact in what way? The negative impact was this. It comes really from the Palestinian perspective. If the Palestinians' national cause has always been something that the Arab world held up as part of our national, kind of our solidarity. So to see 4 or 5, maybe now 6 of those people who were your partners in your cause say, you know what, we have some of our own national interests that are more important than your cause. We're moving on. We're normalizing relationships with Israel, and we've kind of broken ranks of the Palestinian cause. And what the technical term for these accords is really normalization accords, right? Mm-hmm. We didn't have an outstanding conflict with Morocco or with Sudan. There are a few things here that, but they didn't recognize Israel. We've normalized relations that we can now allow trade. But normalization is the word that a lot of the Palestinian struggle puts on normalizing
say, trade relations without a change in the political rights. And that's the fear of the Palestinian cause, is you've given Israel normalization, but we haven't gained any of our political rights. We still don't have a state. There's been, okay, they took off the annexation charge, but in terms of building rights or, there's still Israeli control over Palestinian life. And that's what Palestinians want to change, that call for independence. So in that way, there became a big backlash against anybody doing anything with Israel, because, if you want to force Israel around, you have to play tough and not play with them. That was kind of that's been definitely the short-term effect on the negative effects. There's a big, the BDS got much stronger in the last, 6 months because of those accords, because they, I think in general, I have Palestinian friends who said the last 6 months have felt like the lowest point in the Palestinian national story since 1967.
Because?
So there's no hope. And then you add to that the economic crisis going on with COVID, with the COVID, the economic situation, allies dropping out. The White House was ruled by Trump, who was very, very pro-Israel on a lot of the, so that despair, it can go different directions. Some good, some bad. But I think that's, so the short-term effects have been negative. But I think from Israeli perspective, the beginning of a peace accord with a Muslim country, with an Arab country, is it's something that hasn't happened in a long time, and potentially in the long term as a real opening up of Israel to the east. And I think a lot of Israelis have felt, we will never be accepted here. We have no hope. This is a different language, and we'd rather put our eyes to Europe. And indeed, a lot of Israeli society has European, Jews who came from Europe have that affinity to the West, but a lot of Israelis came from the East and have an affinity to the Arab world, but that was just shut down because of the conflict and kind of cast aside. And I think there's maybe an opening here of Israel to maybe dream about actually being able to be a partner in the world where we are. It's not a simple neighborhood. There's in between us and the Emirates is Syria and Iran, and there's Iraq, and it's not like there's not some massive love affair of the people starting. But I think it's a step. It's potentially a deep step in the right direction.
Do you think there's a difference between the way American Jews perceive the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the way Israeli Jews see the conflict?
10,000%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what, how would you describe the difference?
The visceralness of it. It's not a theoretical here. It's the blood of our children. It's our fear for our loved ones going shopping. It's the rockets in the middle of the night and grabbing your kids at 2 in the morning and running to a bomb shelter. It's a stabbing attack of and because the numbers aren't so high, I think when the numbers go high, American Jewish community feels it more when the images are coming through. But on the general time, I think there's a level of trauma that we carry here that is carried in our bones, in our flesh, in our hugs, and in our embraces, and in our memorial days, which is kind of, as an immigrant to Israel from the U.S., it took years to understand what that is. What is the solemnness on Yom HaZikaron, and hanging out with families and friends that have lost people, and what that feeling is. So there's something very powerful.
Sorry, would you mind explaining what Yom HaZikaron is?
Sorry, yeah. Yom HaZikaron is Israeli the Memorial Day here.
Mm-hmm.
But it's Memorial Day not just for the soldiers who fell, but for anybody who was killed as part of the violence of the conflict. So, and all the other bus bombings or the stabbing attacks or everything, and then the rockets and the soldiers. And it's, Israelis carry some very serious trauma. Now, what we have in common with Jews all over the world and many other people too is we obviously carry that same national trauma. And for Ashkenazi Jews from the Holocaust, it's definitely it's there. But, especially as time goes along and generations move, that Holocaust trauma is probably seeding in the younger Jewish American generation. It's really a different connection back to that trauma. And I think the other big change is generational in the States. You have a generation of American Jews who have never seen Israel in a threat, in a really existential threat. And if you talk to American Jews who remember the 6-Day War or the Yom Kippur War, they had a real sense of fear for what was going to happen, as Israelis did. And I think that sense of fear is something very deep in their consciousness. And the younger generation never felt that. You know, they grew up with an image of Israeli tanks, you know, standing over Palestinian children, and which is a very different image. And not just on the level of image, I want to talk on the level of feeling. And I think those traumatic feelings that's probably the main divide. I could speak more about it if you want to. Like there's actually a non-Jewish.
I could talk to you for days.
I'll say one story. A few years ago, I met through a friend of a friend, a journalist who came here from the Northeast. He was an American journalist, progressive, pretty progressive on Israel. I wouldn't say anti-Israel, but like very critical of Israel. And he was here for about 2 years. He was stationed here. And when he left, he wrote a fascinating article about what happened to his views after living here. And I'm quoting from the article. He said, "I grew up in a very progressive space, very critical of occupation." But he said, "I'll never forget that one day when we were living in Jerusalem, and I was going to work, and my wife told me she was going shopping in this neighborhood. And an hour later, I heard sirens, and on the news, they reported that there was a bombing. And that feeling I felt, not knowing where my wife was for that next 45 minutes until the cell phones were going again, I'll never forget that. And I realize now what Israelis feel. And that's a feeling I can empathize with it, but until you feel it on your flesh, you don't know what it is. And I think that's probably the biggest divide between Israeli and between how we experience the conflict.
It's really what happened to me, you know, when we went there in July 2014 and experienced during Operation Protective Edge and running to bomb shelters repeatedly and the sirens, and I've never gotten over it. Obviously, to me, it led to my transformation and wanting to work on peace, but it's visceral. And I'm a very peace-loving, you know, kind of person. But my first reaction when I had missiles coming at my son, you know, hiding in a bomb shelter, you know, Mama Bear was really mad. And you know, I'm trying to be a good girl and not cuss, but I was, you know, unhappy. And I don't think I've ever gotten over it. I think, you know, living like that, you know, I just can't imagine it. You know, maybe I grew up on too much chicken soup, but it's not something that I could do, but I certainly can empathize. And when you've had the experience, you know, Iron Dome became my BFF, and you know, it's not an experience that I would have signed up for, but strangely enough, it has led to incredible positivity in my life. So saying I'm grateful for it, it's, you know, might be a stretch, but it's important realization that before, of course, when you're Jewish and you grow up and you're raised to care about Israel, but you know, you guys are over there, we're over here, and once you know, we were only there for 2 weeks, but that taste was enough to totally change my life.
So, you know, Penny, that experience could easily have taken to be a person of you know, just of absolute 100% hatred. Yeah. You know, and just right justness of our cause, the wrongness of their cause, and and something in you, you know, managed to channel this to a way that says, no, we need to work for peace is what's going to change that. You know, every single Israeli and every single Palestinian goes through those experiences. And I want to say, like, at this point, it's fair to say, nobody here started the conflict. We were all born there's nobody over 120, you know, we're all born into this. And because that we've all lived on our side, and we face, and we can say that they started it, or we started in a certain way at this point. If we can get that space, I don't care who started it. You know, question, how do we end it? And to be able to channel that space of those moments of trauma into something that can that can seek not just to deepen the trauma it's a very challenging. It's not an easy path. And when Israelis or Palestinians that speak with hate, I protect myself, of course, but I don't blame them in the sense that it's easy to castigate and say, but I think we have to, if I want to be constructive, I have to find a way to move forward here. And a lot of people, say how you self-blaming, or so. It's not about self-blaming. It's about, there's a reality here that my neighbors, I have 60,000 Palestinian neighbors here that I'm afraid to walk into their town for good reason. But can that change? Because actually, I've met more and more and more and more of them, and I've met a bunch of people who are just as tired of the situation as we are. Can we find a way for that moderate voice on both sides to become the voice we see instead of right now we are being led by the extremists. Mm-hmm. The image of Palestine for most Israelis is a suicide belt strapped on a person with a bandana across him. The image of Israel for Palestinians is someone with hair like me that's walking with a machine gun and opening up fire on Palestinian kids. The extremists have won. And until we stand up and put a different voice forward, a different peace plan forward, start asking the questions and doing the work, I think extremists are good. They have a very simple pitch, not all these long answers like I said. It's like they hate us. They hate us. They want to kill us. Let's fight back. It's very simple, and there's a certain very simple appeal of that message, and to challenge it is process. We've phrased the eternal people are not afraid of the long path.
I could talk to you for hours, but if in the end I don't have more questions in the chat, but if you were speaking to the people of the world, what would the message be that you'd want them to know about your work and your communities?
One, I think that there's real life going on here. There's real processes going on. That phenomenon where you have a group that you think about in a certain way, and you finally meet that group in one or the other, and all of a sudden you realize all the complexity and things actually going on inside those stories. And there's a lot to learn about Palestinian and Israeli society. There's a lot of internal things going on, and I think it's important we seek. It's easy to click on the title that says terrorist attack, Israeli soldiers did this, etc. That's the place where it gets our bite. But to find a way to report on the deeper news going on. That's why I'm really grateful, Penny, for giving the stage, the stage, the box. But doing that work of seeing what's going on and looking a little bit deeper. There's finding those sources and learning. And then acting, of course, and going back to action from that learning. But I think that's one of the places we can all do from afar, is just trying to learn, understand more what each side means, and give exposure, and then share when you hear about these kinds of things that are going on. Give them the airspace instead of the negative stuff. I'm sure the negative stuff will find its way onto our news feed. It's about amplifying the work that can be done also.
Oh, that is the truth. Well, that was absolutely terrific, Shaul. I want to thank you so much for this great conversation and your time. I know I learned more about the conflict, and I'm glad especially to hear that there are these great people like yourself and Roots working on peace. I wanted to mention that we have some very interesting guests in the weeks ahead, from these types of sensitive subjects to an Israeli international chess champion, Lior Eisenberg, who, with his organization, Chess for Solidarity, runs chess tournaments between Israelis and Arab countries such as Bahrain and Morocco, and that's how he works on peace. Next week, we're going to be speaking with someone else who works with Roots, Noor Awad, to get a Palestinian perspective on doing peace work with there at Roots. I believe it will be extremely interesting to have heard both of the Israeli and Palestinian sides. But of course, there's as many sides, probably more sides than there are people, with the old Jewish saying, if you have two Jews, then you've got three opinions. But remember, if you weren't able to tune in at this time, soon the recording will be posted at pennyst.com. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that tomorrow is the UN International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And there's so much anti-Semitism now and many Holocaust deniers, unfortunately. I just wanted to say, may the 6 million Jews murdered rest in peace, and their memories be a blessing.
Amen.
To our listeners today and those listening to the recording later, thank you, and may you live in peace. Shalom and salam.
Shalom, shalom.